Every morning, at exactly 7:15, an old red pickup truck pulled into the same gravel lot behind a small diner in Ohio. A man in a plain gray jacket stepped out, walked through the same door, sat at the same corner booth, and ordered the cheapest breakfast on the menu. 2 eggs, dry toast, black coffee. He never asked for anything more. He tipped exactly $10. Not 9, not 11, always 10, for 11 straight months. A 24-year-old waitress named Olivia had watched him do this so many times that she could recognize the crisp bill before he even placed it on the table. The regulars called him cheap behind his back. They didn't know he was worth more money than the entire town combined. They didn't know that $10 bill wasn't a tip at all. It was the final piece of a promise he had spent 25 years trying to keep. And on the day Olivia finally learned the truth, it would change everything she believed about money, about family, and about the quiet, invisible ways kindness travels through a person's life long after the person who gave it is gone. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And if you're new here, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Olivia had grown up in that same small town, in a house that always smelled faintly of instant coffee and dish soap. Her mother worked nights at a factory an hour away, and her grandmother, a woman named Margaret, had raised her for most of her childhood. Margaret passed away when Olivia was only 19, and the grief of that loss still sat quietly in Olivia's chest, tucked away where she didn't have to look at it every day. By the time she was 24, Olivia was working double shifts at the diner to pay for nursing school, falling asleep most nights with a textbook still open on her chest. She wasn't complaining. She simply didn't have the energy left over to complain. Have you ever worked so hard toward something that you forgot what it felt like to rest? That was Olivia's life, one long shift stitched into the next, until the day a stranger's quiet routine became the center of her curiosity. The man's name was Ethan. He never brought security into the diner. He never checked his phone while he ate. He never changed his order, and he never once raised his voice, even when the coffee came out lukewarm or the eggs were slightly overdone. The other customers whispered about him constantly. Someone had recognized his face from a business magazine left in the break room, and word had spread fast that the quiet man in the corner booth owned a company worth billions of dollars. People couldn't understand why a man like that would eat breakfast at a diner that smelled like old grease and bleach, tipping barely enough to matter to someone with his kind of money. Billionaires are supposed to throw money around. The owner joked one morning while wiping down the counter. This one's the stingiest rich man I've ever met. Olivia laughed along with everyone else. But some quiet part of her never quite believed that explanation. There was something in the way Ethan looked at the room. He didn't look at his food or his phone. He looked at the walls, the booths, the chipped tile floor, almost like he was searching for something that used to be there and wasn't anymore. He looked at Olivia the same way sometimes, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before he caught himself and looked back down at his coffee. She noticed it and brushed it off as nothing. People imagine things when they're tired, she told herself. Still, there was a stillness to him that felt less like coldness and more like patience. The kind of patience a person only develops after waiting a very long time for something they're unsure will ever come. Has anyone in your life ever looked at you like that? Like they knew something about you that you didn't know yourself? For 11 months, Ethan's routine never wavered. Rain or snow, he was there at 7:15, gone by 7:45, always leaving that same folded $10 bill beneath the edge of his plate. Olivia had started looking forward to it in a strange way. His visits gave a small, steady rhythm to her exhausting weeks. So, when he didn't show up one Tuesday morning, she noticed immediately. She told herself he was probably just running late, maybe stuck in traffic or dealing with something at his company. But 7:15 became 7:30, then 8 o'clock, then the breakfast rush came and went, and the corner booth stayed empty. The owner joked that maybe Ethan had finally found a diner with better coffee. Olivia laughed along, but something in her stomach had already tightened into a small, quiet worry she couldn't explain to herself, let alone to anyone else. 3 days passed with the same empty booth. On the 4th morning, a black SUV pulled into the lot instead of the familiar red pickup truck. Olivia watched through the window, half expecting Ethan to step out in his usual gray jacket. Instead, a man in a dark suit walked through the door, glanced around the diner, and asked for her by name. He introduced himself as a lawyer representing Ethan's estate. Olivia's chest went cold at the word estate. He handed her a plain white envelope, said very little else, and left almost as quickly as he had arrived. Her hands were shaking as she opened it at the end of her shift, alone in the small back room where the staff kept their coats. Inside was a single old photograph, black and white, worn soft at the corners. There was no letter, no explanation, just a photograph, and on the back, in faded pencil, 2 words were written: $10. The woman in the photograph wore a waitress uniform Olivia didn't recognize, standing in front of a diner counter that looked strangely familiar despite the outdated fixtures and the old cash register. Olivia stared at the woman's face for a long time that night, unable to shake the feeling that she had seen those eyes somewhere before, in old photo albums, in memories she hadn't visited in years. She barely slept. The next morning, before her shift, she drove to the town library and asked the librarian for help searching old newspaper archives from decades earlier. It took hours of scrolling through faded microfilm, but eventually she found a matching photograph in a community newspaper clipping from 40 years earlier. The caption underneath named the woman as a waitress at that very diner. Her name was Margaret. Olivia's hands went still on the keyboard. That was her grandmother's name. If you're still watching, go ahead and type the word promise in the comments below. I want to know who's been following every clue in this story right alongside Olivia. Olivia spent the next several days piecing together fragments of a story that had been hiding in plain sight her entire life. She remembered her grandmother mentioning only once a winter many decades earlier when she had worked at that same diner as a young woman, back when the building still had its original counter and the old bell above the door. Margaret had rarely spoken about those years. Whenever Olivia had asked about her grandmother's past, Margaret would simply smile, change the subject, and say that some stories were better lived than told. Olivia had always assumed that was just one of her grandmother's quiet, old-fashioned sayings. Now, she wondered if there had been an actual memory behind those words, something painful or precious that Margaret had chosen to protect rather than explain. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved was carrying a story they never told you? To understand what happened next, we have to go back nearly 50 years to a winter so cold that the pipes in half the houses in town had frozen solid. A young boy named Ethan lived with his mother in a small rented apartment above a hardware store. His father had left when Ethan was still a baby, and his mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, cleaning hotel rooms during the day and taking and mending work at night. That particular winter had been especially hard. His mother had lost hours at the hotel when the tourist season slowed down, and there had been a week when there simply wasn't enough money left for food after the rent was paid. Ethan remembered the sound his stomach made in class, and the way his teacher would sometimes quietly slip him an extra sandwich from her own lunch without ever mentioning it in front of the other kids. One morning, his mother decided they needed a proper meal, even if it meant going without something else later. She took Ethan's hand and walked him 3 blocks through the snow to the diner, the same one that would decades later become the center of this entire story. They sat down at a booth near the window, and Ethan remembers the warmth of the heater more than anything, how it felt against his frozen fingers after the walk. His mother looked at the menu for a long time before quietly telling the waitress she would just have coffee. Ethan didn't understand at the time that she was giving up her own meal so he could eat. He only understood it years later, once he was old enough to do the math on what coffee cost compared to breakfast, and old enough to recognize what real sacrifice looked like. The waitress that morning was Margaret. She noticed the way Ethan's mother's hands trembled slightly as she counted the coins in her coat pocket, not from cold, but from the quiet humiliation of not having enough. Margaret didn't say a word about it. She disappeared into the kitchen for a moment, then returned and told them, gently, that a customer who had already left had paid for their breakfast in advance and wanted it to go to whoever needed it that morning. It wasn't true. There was no customer. Margaret had quietly covered the cost herself, using $10 from her own tip jar, money she had been saving toward her own rent. She never told them the truth. She simply smiled, refilled Ethan's mother's coffee, and let them believe that morning had been an ordinary stroke of luck rather than an act of deliberate kindness. Before they left, Ethan's mother tried to thank her properly, tears in her eyes, insisting she would pay it back somehow. Margaret shook her head and said something Ethan never forgot for the rest of his life. She told them that when they were able, they shouldn't pay her back directly. Instead, she asked that they simply keep the kindness moving forward, passing it on to someone else whenever they had the chance. Ethan, only 7 years old at the time, didn't fully understand what she meant. But he understood the warmth of that meal, and he understood, even as a child, that something important had just happened to him, something he wanted to hold on to for the rest of his life. Before they walked back out into the cold, young Ethan quietly made a promise to himself. one he wouldn't fully explain to anyone for another 25 years. Life did not become easier quickly. Ethan's mother continued working 2 jobs for years afterward, and Ethan grew up understanding the value of a dollar in a way many of his classmates never had to learn. He studied hard, not because school came naturally to him, but because he understood it was the only path available to him out of the kind of poverty that made a mother sit with just coffee while her son ate. He worked through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, eventually landing a position at a small engineering firm where his ideas about efficient manufacturing caught the attention of an investor willing to take a chance on him. It took over a decade of relentless work, setbacks, and near failures before that company grew into the multi-billion-dollar corporation it eventually became. Through all of it, Ethan never forgot that snowy morning or the woman who had quietly protected his mother's dignity without ever asking for anything in return. Once Ethan finally had the resources to do so, he tried to track Margaret down, hoping to properly thank her and repay the kindness she had shown his family all those years earlier. It took private investigators several months to locate any information about her, and when they finally did, the news broke something in him that money could never fix. Margaret had passed away 3 years earlier, quietly, in her sleep, surrounded by very few people who ever knew the full extent of what she had done for strangers over the course of her life. Ethan sat with that loss for a long time. He had built an empire in part because of a promise he made to a woman he could no longer thank in person. 6 months after learning of her passing, he made a decision that would define the next several years of his life. He returned to the same diner, now under new ownership but structurally unchanged, and began showing up every single morning at 7:15, ordering the same simple breakfast Margaret had once quietly paid for. Each morning, he left exactly $10, the same amount Margaret had spent to protect his mother's dignity decades earlier. It wasn't about the money. $10 meant nothing to a man of his wealth. It was about honoring the exact weight of what that gesture had once meant to a frightened 7-year-old boy and his exhausted mother. He never told the staff who he was or why he came. He simply wanted, quietly and consistently, to sit in the same seat, order the same meal, and remember. What he didn't expect, 11 months into this routine, was to find himself watching a young waitress whose face carried an unmistakable echo of someone he had spent 25 years trying to find a way to thank. Back in the present, Olivia sat at her grandmother's old kitchen table late one night, going through a box of Margaret's belongings she had never had the heart to open until now. Near the bottom, wrapped carefully in a faded scarf, she found an old leather diary with a cracked spine. Her hands trembled as she opened it to a page dated the exact winter Ethan had described in the documents the lawyer eventually shared with her. Margaret had written about a mother and a young boy who had come in from the cold that morning, about the mother's trembling hands, and about the $10 she had quietly taken from her own tips to protect a stranger's dignity. She had written that she hoped, someday, that small kindness would find its way back out into the world through someone else. Olivia sat in stunned silence, realizing that the man she had served breakfast to every single morning for nearly a year had been quietly honoring her own grandmother the entire time. The final piece of the story came directly from Ethan himself, through a recorded message his lawyer delivered to Olivia along with his personal belongings from the diner. In it, Ethan explained that he had never simply been coming for breakfast. After learning of Margaret's passing, he had also learned, through quiet research, that she had a granddaughter working at the very diner where the story had begun. He hadn't approached her directly at first, unsure of how to explain the situation without it feeling strange or overwhelming. Instead, he chose to sit quietly, morning after morning, hoping that in time, the truth would reveal itself naturally, the same way Margaret's small kindness had once revealed itself to him, without pressure, without spectacle, simply through patience and presence. If you were in Olivia's position, discovering a stranger had quietly shaped your entire life without ever explaining why, how do you think you would feel? Ethan's absence, it turned out, had a far simpler explanation than anyone feared. He had been quietly undergoing treatment for a serious but manageable health condition he had kept private from nearly everyone in his life, choosing to handle it away from public attention rather than turn his personal struggle into a headline. The envelope and photograph had been prepared in advance, a precaution in case his condition worsened unexpectedly. Thankfully, it did not. Several weeks later, Ethan returned to the diner in person for the first time since his disappearance, sitting once again in his usual corner booth. When Olivia approached the table, her hands trembling slightly around her notepad, he finally told her everything, filling in every gap the photograph and diary had left behind, connecting 25 years of quiet gratitude to the granddaughter of the woman who had made it all possible. In the months that followed, Ethan quietly funded a full nursing scholarship in Margaret's name, covering the remainder of Olivia's tuition and allowing her to finally step back from the exhausting double shifts that had been draining her for years. He insisted on remaining anonymous during the announcement, not wanting the gesture to feel like charity or spectacle, but simply like kindness, continuing to move forward the way Margaret had once asked of his mother. Olivia had assumed, understandably, that a man as busy as Ethan wouldn't be able to attend her graduation ceremony months later. She scanned the crowd during the applause, expecting only her mother and a few old co-workers from the diner. Then the announcer mentioned that the scholarship covering her tuition had come from a single anonymous donor who wished to honor someone important from his past. Olivia looked toward the back of the room, and there he was, standing quietly near the exit, offering nothing more than a small, knowing smile. Years passed. Olivia became a nurse, just as she had always dreamed, working long but fulfilling shifts at the regional hospital where Margaret herself had once been treated as a patient decades earlier. Eventually, when the original owners of the diner decided to retire, Olivia made the decision to buy the small building herself, keeping much of its original character intact, including the same corner booth by the window. She hung a single black and white photograph near the register, the same one that had started everything, so that anyone curious enough to ask could learn the story behind it. Ethan still visits occasionally, though far less frequently now, always sitting in that same booth, always insisting on paying for his own simple breakfast out of habit more than necessity. Some habits, it turns out, aren't really about money at all. They're about memory. One winter morning, years after everything had come full circle, a tired young father walked into the diner with his daughter, quietly counting coins from his coat pocket before ordering the cheapest thing on the menu. Olivia recognized the look on his face immediately, the same quiet embarrassment Margaret must have recognized in Ethan's mother decades earlier. When a young father tried to pay, Olivia told him gently that his meal had already been covered by an earlier customer, then slipped exactly $10 beneath the receipt from her own pocket before he could argue. His daughter, maybe 6 or 7 years old, tugged on Olivia's sleeve and asked her why she had done that for a stranger. Olivia knelt down beside the little girl's chair and told her, in the simplest way she knew how, that kindness was never really measured by how much a person gives. It's measured by whether they're willing to keep a promise made by someone who came before them, long after that person is gone. Before we close out tonight's story, we want to ask you something directly. If a stranger had quietly shaped the course of your entire life without ever explaining why, the way Ethan did for Olivia, how do you think you would feel discovering the truth all at once, the way she did? And if you were in Margaret's position that snowy morning, would you have made the same choice she did, giving up money you couldn't really afford to spare, simply to protect the dignity of a stranger you would likely never see again? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and we always love hearing which parts of these stories stay with you the longest. If tonight's story moved you even a little, consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that small acts of kindness rarely disappear. They simply wait quietly, sometimes for decades, until they find their way back into the world through someone new. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, and we'll see you in the next story.